The car had its annual MOT and only failed on the 2 rear bushes, which were £48 a pair plus $39.90 for the bush removal install sleeve kit. The mileage was 126,000 miles, and this was another year where the cost of passing the MOT was under £150, including the MOT test fee. Other than a trolley jack, you'll need the following main items for this job: a pair of new rear bushes, a specific bush installation tool, around £39.90, 16, 17, 18 and 21mm sockets, a torque wrench able to torque to 110 Nm. I found a bottle jack to come in handy, and dare I say, an air impact wrench. So I've already done the Nearside bush, so I've only got the old one left in there now. So this is the new one for the Offside, and as you can see, it's a circular hole. And if I take the old one out, which I've just done, you'll see it's an oval hole. So the oval hole was for the passenger side, and the round hole is for the driver's side. So you must note that. So that's the bushes. There is actually a piece of paper with some instructions on which show that one side is different to the other one, as you can see there. So you may want to pause it at this point. So this is the main sleeve of the kit, and we have this one, which is the removal part. So that pushes onto the old bush and pushes it out. If I put the old bush in and show you, so that's the old bush in there, and this is the removal part, which slides inside. It's quite a narrow diameter, that one. So that's the new bush, and this part is the one that's used for installing the new bush, and it sort of straddles over the metal bracket at the top, and that will then be used to push the new bush into place. So one thing you must note with the bolt is that it must be greased. So put plenty of grease onto this. Oil isn't sufficient, but also note that the bolt can only take 80 to 100 Newton meters of force on the screw. So you mustn't go over 100 Newton meters when removing or installing the bushes. So I used the torque wrench to make sure I didn't overdo that. Now 21mm is the size for the nut and bolt on this. So you may want a spanner and a socket. And both of those are 21mm. A penetrating spray would also come in very handy. So we have 17mm socket here, which is for removal of the road wheels. Put that onto a breaker bar. We have 18mm for the suspension strut. And the 4 bolts underneath, including the bush, is 16mm. And also a wire brush to clean when we actually remove the bush and before inserting the new bush. We will need to loosen the wheel nuts on both rear wheels, as we are replacing both bushes, and replacing either bush requires the rear of the car to be lifted completely off the ground. The rear axle will need freedom to move around to give us access to the bushes. Use a 17mm socket on a breaker bar. I'm going to chock the front wheels for safety reasons. I can then loosen the wheel nuts while the vehicle is still on the ground. If you haven't already done so, we also need to release the handbrake. If it's the electronic one, the procedure is as follows. Now to release the handbrake, we need to make sure the ignition's on, and then we pull the lever and push the button at the same time. And now it's released. You get a warning on the dashboard, parking brake is off, and that then turns red. There's also a manual release handle in the centre console underneath the plastic flap. We can now jack the rear of the car up and ideally place on axle stands for extra safety. So you might need to jack each side of the car up bit by bit until you've got both wheels completely off the ground, and then secure the car with axle stands. So with the wheels in the air, we can now safely remove the offside road wheel using the 17mm socket and the breaker bar. And wheel that away somewhere safely. With the rear axle resting nicely on the trolley jack, we can remove the suspension strut using an 18mm socket. This was very tight and it might be worth spraying some penetrating fluid onto the bolt first. So we need to remove the suspension strut here, which is using an 18mm socket. Now it's worth liberally applying some penetrating fluid and cleaning the end where the bolt thread is open, because this again is quite a tough nut once it's been on there for a while. Yes, again I resort to the Clark Pro with its extendable handle. It's like no bolt can resist this thing. If anything, your possible worry is that you might actually break the bolt, hence so much penetrating fluid. So what you might find, like I did, was that you need to adjust the suspension because the springs and everything might be pushing on that bolt, and so you can't really get it out. It's not in alignment. So you might need to just lift it up a bit with the trolley jack, and then you'll probably find the bolt just comes straight out like that. Might be worth cleaning that thread with a wire brush before putting it back in again. We now need to remove the axle mounting plate. The plate is held in position with three 16mm headed bolts and the 16mm headed bolt that passes through the bush. It's wise to clean the area around the plate and mark its position with a marker pen or paint, as this plate affects wheel alignment. We mustn't forget to unclip this ABS sensor wire. It comes out there like a grommet, just pushes out, and then there's like a circular plastic clip that it can also unclip from. If we leave that in place and then drop the axle, there is a risk of damaging that wire. So this is the mounting plate that holds the rear axle on. This bolt here goes through the centre of the bush that we're going to be replacing. So you've got this main bolt there, and then there's three other bolts that also hold the plate on. But it is worth noting before doing any of this that to clean this area and to actually mark it round with either a permanent marker pen or some paint. Something so you know exactly where that plate came from, because if its position moves, it does technically mean the wheels could be out of alignment, and really you should then take it to Renault and get the alignment checked. The bolt here is always a problem. It protrudes up underneath the car and it is open to the elements, so I was hoping it may just come undone, but it didn't, so I'm going to have to work on that one later. The other ones, though, tend to come out okay. As you remove the bolts, it is always worth cleaning the threads with a wire brush or something, so when you reinsert them there's no debris on the bolt threads. That could affect the torque settings and give a incorrect reading. So this one's quite a long bolt, seems to have an awful lot of like aluminium oxide corrosion on the thread, and that's the one that goes through the bush that we'll be changing. I'm going to cheat again and use the air impact wrench. It tends to make life a little bit easier. This bolt had exactly the same problem as on the other side. A lot of thread is open to the elements and becomes heavily rusted, so penetrating fluid and either an air wrench or plenty of patience is required. Unfortunately, on the first video I did of the other side, you can see where I'm working a lot clearer. This one you can't really see because the camera's in the wrong position, and then obviously I had to be very careful because of the penetrating spray getting onto the camera lens. But basically it was using plenty of lubricants onto the threads, undo it a little bit with the air wrench, wind it back in again, and just keep repeating that process until the bolt comes down a little bit more each time. Takes a while, not too bad though with the air wrench. I think by hand it might be quite a game of patience, that. So eventually we get the mounting bracket off. So now we can concentrate on the actual bush. Now comes the removal of the bush with the newly bought sleeve tool. This sleeve kit needed 21mm spanners and sockets. Right, so there's the bush. I'll highlight that in yellow. So we can now push the axle back a little bit. We only need to push it back enough just to get the sleeve tool in. So it's sort of push it back and maybe drop it down a bit just so the sleeve will fit in there. I'll give this a quick clean because there's a lot of debris on this one. And soak it with plenty of penetrating fluid. This will ease the load on the bolt thread of the sleeve kit. Worth removing any obvious lumps of mud and that, and then perhaps spray it again with some penetrating fluid. So it's worth leaving this for a few minutes just to let the penetrating fluid seep in. So we must grease the bolt thread quite well, bearing in mind it can only take a torque of 80 to 100 Newton meters. So we start with the large sleeve on the top because we're going to pull the bush upwards into that large sleeve inside. It can be a struggle to get the bolt in here because you've got like the carbon canister, I think it is, for the fuel tank just above. So we now use the adapter at the bottom used to push it out. Now on my set that was a diameter of 77 millimeters. So wind that up. And be generous with the grease. The more grease the better, I think, on this. Final tightening and removal of the bush. I used a torque wrench set to 80 and then 100 Newton meters to ensure I didn't overstress the bolt thread, as the instructions said it's not designed to take more than 100 Newton meters. So I've set the torque wrench to 80 Newton meters just as a safety measure. It probably won't reach anywhere near that because we're removing it. But if it had seized in, then at least we'd get some warning that the bolt thread itself was likely to be overstressed. But thankfully this just came straight out, so there's no problem there. And here it comes. That was quite a nice easy job, that one. In theory this should just come straight out with the bush in place, but I always seem to be struggling for some reason, so I undid the nut. So this is the uninstalling piece. I'm still struggling with this bolt, aren't I? And then remove the sleeve, and there's our bush that we can replace now. Now that's the one with the circular hole. The other side was the oval hole. This is the circular one, and the circular one is on the driver's side, and there's the new one. So we just need to grease that and put that one in now. So don't forget to brush all the loose debris away, so it's a nice clean hole that we have to push it back into. Now to install the new bush. So I used a bit of spray grease just on the outside of the new bush, so that should help it slide in quite nicely. Again, it will take the load off the screw that's going to be used to push that in. Don't drop it. Note the position of the top plate, the metal plate, because that is like a metal pad that sits under the body of the car. So we then use this piece, which is the installation, and that straddles over the metal parts, as you can see. And then we have the main sleeve underneath, because we're going to be pulling the bush downwards into the big sleeve. And then we put our nut on the top. So the diameter of the installation adapter in my set was 80mm. I think I would cheat and use an air ratchet on this. So the nut and the bolt head are both 21mm. So again, I'll set my torque wrench to 80 Newton meters until I get a first click, and then I'll adjust that to 100 where I know it's at maximum, and then I'll leave it at that point. It's quite satisfying watching it go in at high speed. When you do it for real, it hardly moves. .80 Newton meter click. So now I adjust it to 100 Newton meters, which is the maximum the bolt thread can take. And there's our 100 Newton meter click. So we can just remove it all now, and that's the other side done. Hopefully this will keep the MOT man happy and we'll get a pass. Just a slightly trickier job of aligning it all up without cross-threading any of the bolts. Now the new bush is home, we can reattach the rear axle by installing the mounting plate with the three 16mm bolts and the long 16mm bolt that goes through the bush itself. So the task here is to get all four bolts loosely bolted up with the axle horizontal. Now I did find sometimes that using a trolley jack with the bottle jack just to try and tilt the rear axle to get it level can make a difference. Also bolting the suspension strut back up can then also take some of the weight and help as well. So I'm going to use the trolley jack just to bring that metal pad on the bush up to the bottom of the car, because that rests underneath the car. Now hopefully if you've made alignment marks where the mounting bracket was, because you need to try and get that bracket back where it was in the same position ideally. So the metal plate on the bush was at a slight angle, so this is where I used the bottle jack just to tilt it, to bring it sort of flat, because as you put that big bolt in you don't want it to cross thread, so you do need it all aligned quite nicely. And then I use this just metal bar just to pull it in to help again with the alignments where it's got to go. It's more of just a fiddly task, this one. And here's the underside view. Probably see a bit better from this angle. So my intention was to get all four bolts threaded in without being cross-threaded, and then once I knew that all four were aligned I could then gradually take up the slack on all the bolts bit by bit until they all came together. I did clean all the bolts with a wire brush and sprayed them all with a little bit of grease. See, I was struggling with the alignments on this main bush bolt. It just wasn't going in. So clearly it still wasn't level and lined up. So I concluded that reattaching the suspension strut might be a good idea to help. And reattach the suspension strut using the 18mm socket and torque to 110 Newton meters. Again, I sprayed some grease onto that. Again, the bottle jack came in handy on this, just to tweak it enough to get the bolt to line up. And then this bolt is torqued to the 110 Newton meters. Now the rear axle is more level and has been locked into place by bolting the struts back in, we should find it easier to finish bolting the mounting bracket back into place. That seems to have made all the difference, and now that main bush bolt goes straight in. So we can bring them all up now, bit by bit. So as you do the final tightening up, just try and ensure that that plate is aligned where it used to be. In the Haynes manual it's 80 Newton meters for the axle bolts. I presume that applies to all 4 of these bolts. So if you're unsure if the mounting plates went back into exactly the right place, it's probably worth taking the car to Renault and just getting the rear wheel alignment checked with them. I presume if it's slightly out, you may get a bit of tyre wear from the misalignment. So we need to clip the ABS wire back in. So that part just clips into the plastic circular holder. And then this piece is like a push-in grommet, and push that back onto the axle. There we go. Replace the road wheel using a 17mm socket and then temporarily activate the rear handbrake. So you can tighten the wheel nuts to 110 Newton meters. I'm going to reactivate the handbrake so that I can torque the wheels up without them spinning. So set my torque wrench to 110 and just tighten them all in a cross diagonal manner. That's that job done. Thank you for watching and hope this helped some home mechanics out.